right, welcome to this Saturday afternoon virtual conversation at this year's Six Bridges Book Festival. My name is Sarah Kellogg, and we're so glad you joined us this afternoon. You are in for such a delightful and, dare I say, sweet conversation. But before I introduce the authors that will be joining me, let me just get a quick housekeeping item out of the way. So if you have a question that you would like to ask our authors, please use the question and answer function and type it in there. Though I will be keeping an eye on the chat, it could get lost there. So it's much better if you use the question and answer option. And also because we have not one, but three authors, if you could say who you want to answer the question, and if it's all of them, that's great too. That would be greatly appreciated. I would also like to give a big thank you for the sponsors in this discussion At Home in Arkansas and KUAR FM 89.1. The support of sponsors is what makes our festival great. So now let's get started with our conversation. I'm so excited to introduce all of our authors, Angela Garbacz, Katherine Alford, and Kathy Gunst. So Angela is the owner of Goldenrod Pastries located in Lincoln, Nebraska. After earning multiple degrees in the culinary arts, she began a blog also entitled Goldenrod Pastries after learning that she had a dairy allergy and wanted to find alternative ways to make dairy-free desserts for herself. The blog expanded to include gluten-free and vegan recipes, and that blog then became a shop. Food and Wine has called her one of the most innovative women in food and drink. Her book is called Perfectly Golden: Adaptable Recipes for Sweet and Simple Treats. Welcome, Angela.
Hi.
Katherine ran the New York Times 4-star kitchen at Quilted Giraffe. She also has spent the last 20 years at the Food Network, writing a column for Food Network magazine, running its test kitchen, and serving as senior vice president of culinary. She has also made television appearances, such as being a guest judge on the Food Network's Ultimate Recipe Showdown. When asked in an interview about what food is her secret guilty pleasure, she responded, quote, "I try never to feel guilty about eating." She grew up in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you.
Kathy is a James Beard award-winning journalist and is the author of 15 cookbooks. She is the resident chef of the NPR program Here and Now, where she most recently shared some noodle soup recipes for the fall. Here and Now broadcasts to more than 550 public radio stations across the nation, including right here in Little Rock. While serving as the culinary editor for Food and Wine magazine, Kathy was inspired to move to Maine, where she now resides. She also guest teaches food journalism around the world. Welcome, Kathy. Oh, Kathy, you're muted. If you could unmute yourself.
Thank you. Great to be here. Hi.
So we're going to start off with each of you reading a passage and maybe sharing a recipe from your respective books. So Angela, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I will be reading a little blurb from the intro of my book, Perfectly Golden. Thank you so much for the great introduction, Sarah. Woman-powered baking. Like many chefs I know, I learned to bake from my mother and both of my grandmothers. We spent days and days in the kitchen together, preparing for Sunday family dinners, making rolls for holiday meals, birthday cakes, and holiday cookie boxes. We always had our most incredible and substantive conversations while standing over kitchen counters, rolling dough, and watching sugar boil. Without knowing it, we were solving problems, answering questions, and for me, it was a great way to ask my grandmothers about their lives. My maternal grandmother lived through the Great Depression, and my paternal grandmother survived World War II. These two women were my very best friends, and the stories and lives that they lived made me crave more information. I knew that our time in the kitchen was the perfect time to talk. I work with a predominantly female staff at Goldenrod Pastries. Working well with other women and supporting them to feel empowered while also feeling that support reciprocated has been one of the most satisfying experiences of my life. They make me feel safe, confident, and unstoppable. And that is what we all deserve to experience. My message to women reading this is to find other women who make you feel wonderful. Surround yourself with them and be one of those women yourself. Find women who want to celebrate you in your moments of greatness and will support you no matter the outcome. Great things happen when women come together, and great things are created.
Thank you, Angela. Katherine and Kathy's book is entitled Rage Baking: The Transformative Power of Flour, Fury, and Women's Voices. So Katherine and Kathy, take it away.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to just read a little bit from the introduction to Rage Baking, which explains a little bit about how the project started. It was exactly 2 years ago, late September 2018. I was glued to the television. I listened all day as the Senate grilled Dr. Christine Blasey Ford about the incident, as they called it, with Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. I watched as Rachel Mitchell, a female prosecutor from Arizona, the woman puppet for the men in gray suits, asked the same questions over and over again. And I remember thinking, why is this called a hearing? No one is really listening to Dr. Ford. I kept asking myself, why would this woman risk her career, her family, safety, and reputation to challenge a Supreme Court nominee if it never really happened? A line from a song in the musical Hamilton kept running through my head. No one else was in the room when it happened. And I remember thinking towards the end of the hearing, when it became clear that despite all the testimony, they would push Kavanaugh through. Women don't get heard. That week, late one night, I found myself in my kitchen, pulling flour, sugar, butter, and baking powder out of the pantry. I decided to bake a simple almond cake topped with late summer fruit. I scooped out the flour and made sure it was perfectly level in my measuring cup. I softened the butter. I listened to the whole almonds growl as I chopped them in the blender. I peeled ripe peaches and caught every last drop of their sweet juice in my batter. I scattered the last of the tart wild Maine blueberries on top, and a few hours later, I had a gorgeous cake and a calmer heart. Did the baking stop the rage? Hell no. Did the baking make all the lies and deceit and behind the scenes dealings feel less menacing? Not one bit. Did the baking make me feel less afraid of the erosion of democracy I was witnessing as I listened to the evening news? No, it didn't do any of those things. What it did was reset my focus for a few short hours. It became a balm, a meditation of sorts. Baking was a way of temporarily restoring my belief in the positive transformation of things. In this case, butter, sugar, flour, and fruit.
All right, so I'm going to read an essay, also obviously from Rage Baking, called "We Can Be Sweet and Savory." In the food world, people often get divided into bakers and savory cooks, and all too often these roles get gendered. Men get the knives and flame, and women get the sugar and butter. Women make cookies, and men become professional pastry chefs. I heard this repeatedly in the years I worked in professional kitchens. There was no shame in men saying they didn't feel comfortable with desserts. But if I did the inverse, like I don't feel comfortable butchering or grilling a steak or working the hotline, I wouldn't be taken seriously. I had to be up for anything. I totally relate to the quote, Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in high heels. In restaurants in the 1980s, it wasn't unusual to be the only woman on staff and to endure blatant and outrageous sexism. I was harassed and shamed and had to tolerate mansplaining that would make your head explode. My favorite, you can't whip egg whites when you have your period. It does something to the eggs. Who knew my uterus was so magical? When a new chef was hired in the 4-star restaurant that I worked in, I was offered the job of running the pastry and dessert department, not because I was any better than the highly skilled crew in place, but because I was the girl. But in the long run, I was better off. I developed a wider range of skills that served me in my long career. I became a careful baker. I liked the science, the math, the discipline of baking, the satisfaction. I love the nuance that goes into baking, the way the temperature of butter can make all the difference in a flaky pie crust, and the way measuring improperly can throw off a cookie. And the biggest secret, confidence is your most important ingredient. It's ironic that women get pushed into the part of cooking that requires the most math, chemistry, and precision. So if you want your daughters to excel at STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, bring them into the kitchen, bake with them. The results will be sweet and empowering.
So thank you all so much. So my first question, and all of my questions, I'm so excited, is for everyone. So what inspired you to write your books?
Well, I got chills listening to both Katherine and Kathy when you were reading your excerpts, because it's so relatable and it's so, yeah, that it's a lot. But to answer your question, Sarah, I try to focus on really accessible baking. So whether that is for your diet, if you're gluten-free, dairy-free, vegan, any of those things, or to be accessible technique-wise. I have had so many cookbooks and so many people come to me with questions that are way, the technique is just blown out of proportion for them and for a home cook. And I wanted to make a book and write recipes for people that would be really unassuming and really easy to do, because we all get what it means to be in the kitchen and what it does for you and how great it makes you feel and how great it is to provide food for other people, and how great that feels. But if you're making it inaccessible through technique or budget, it's really hard to get more people involved. And so my book was something that I had always wanted to do. And as my business started to evolve to, empower people in different ways, whether it's the way that they choose to eat, empowering women to be strong in the food industry and to not put up with, the shit that Katherine was talking about, finding a way to make techniques to make really wonderful, accessible food at home. I just knew that that had to be my mission, is accessibility.
So I would say Kathy and I have been friends for over 10 years. And when all of this was going on, and Kathy was rage baking in Maine and I was rage baking in New York City, and we were talking about this, and between the two of us, I think we've done over 23 whatever cookbooks. And we were talking about this in a way, and what was going on in, in the political landscape, which seems so calm compared to what's going on now. But we were angry and we wanted to take our skills and do something with them. And one day I just said to Kathy, we should do a cookbook. And when we were both like, yes, but we both also knew that we did not want it to be a traditional cookbook. And we didn't want it to just be us. We wanted to create, as Angela was saying, that collective of women's voices. And so we started the project. We sort of didn't know where we wanted it to be. We knew that we wanted it to be pro-social and a tool for the 2020 election. And we wanted a lot of different kinds of women's voices in it. And we sent out a wide range of, to the people in our network, women we did know, women we didn't know. And we said, did you want to be a part of this project? And I can't tell you how fast the emails came back that just said, hell yeah, I want to be part of this. And then Kathy and I just started just fantasizing about what the book would be. And it was an incredibly amazing project that sort of had a life of its own.
Yeah, it very much, Rage Baking is very much a collective of women of all ages, of all backgrounds, of all religions. And it was really important to us that we get a wide variety of women's voices. So there'll be names in there that you recognize, like Carla Hall and Dory Greenspan, and there'll be names of women maybe you don't know who wrote gorgeous essays. Our friend Halle Bay Ramdeen, a young, incredible writer, Osei Ayendelin. I got to interview Ani DeFranco. We interviewed Hollywood writers, and we interviewed people you've never heard of. And what happened was, you get a little sense of it in the introduction. The book really started with rage and anger and a feeling of really being distraught. And as I read, it was not that the baking fixed any of that, but by the time we were ready to turn the book in and we had reached out to over 40 women, I personally felt a sense of hope reading what these women had written, making their gorgeous cakes, cookies, breads, pies, puddings, and rereading the interviews that we had done with these women and feeling the power in what happens when women come together as a community.
And what's so powerful about that is, like, even just listening to you talk about it and hearing the excerpts that you shared, it makes you feel like, oh yeah, there's this group of people and I feel like I'm a part of it, and these women are me and I am them. And I think that, like, that's such a powerful thing, especially with everything that goes on and has been going on since, the hearings, and or just in general. And it just feels really good to know that there's this community of people you've heard of and people you've never heard of. It doesn't matter. We're all in this.
And it was, as we worked on the project, you start to really think about where baking and how baking sort of fits in our lives. And for one thing, like if you bake a cake or a pie or whatever, it's a communal thing. You know, ideally you don't sit down and eat a whole cake. Sometimes I do feel that way these days.
That's called rage eating.
But they're communal, and they also are markers for important events in our lives, whether it's a birthday or a wedding or a special occasion, or just that, like as someone said, you know, it's just been a bad day. I need to have, you know, a delicious chocolate pudding from Alice Medrick, which is like the most comforting, you know, thing that we can have there. And also the thing about this book that was so exciting was, you know, we said to, you know, one of my favorites in the book was from a wonderful woman, Elle Simone, who she worked with me at Food Network and is now at America's Test Kitchen. And she said, she's like, oh, absolutely, I want to be part of this. She sent a recipe. And then she said, you know, I think can I send you a poem? And I was like, sure, you know, a head note can be a poem or whatever. And she sent this poem. The cake was inspired by her great-grandmother. And the poem is about her great-grandmother's, how she would prepare this lemon pound cake, and it's the most amazing lemon pound cake, and other dishes, and send with her children and her grandchildren north during Jim Crow to Detroit. And it chronicles the importance of food and community. And I challenge you to make that cake and read that poem while it's in the oven and not be moved to tears, and also feel connected to how important it is to keep these traditions and voices alive.
Yeah, and oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think also that, you know, you always say that if you're in a car with somebody, you're able to have like a really good conversation that maybe you wouldn't be able to have if you're just sitting across the table from them, or like it feels like there's more pressure. And I always found that being able to be in the kitchen with somebody, and now what we're doing is baking over social media with people. And I have found the people who are using my book and baking from it, the conversations that it sounds like you've had are all structured around food. And how lucky are we to be able to be, you know, women who have lived these lives over food and had these conversations and learned these stories from people because of food. And I think that that's like a very special thing that, you know, the situations that are predominantly male-based that you were talking about, Katherine, in the kitchen, you know, that's something that is very different from what we got to have been able to experience with food. And it kind of is a restructuring of, you know, what did we get out of it? What do we get out of it? What do we experience from it?
And
Yeah.
Angela, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, we just get to bake down the patriarchy. That's all.
Exactly.
And so I'd like to talk about accessibility in baking, which you mentioned earlier, Angela, was a big part of your book. And so, you know, there are many ways to make baking accessible, making it dairy-free, gluten-free, vegan, etc. But yeah, accessibility also applies to both technique, monetarily. You know, I just bought a pastry cutter. You know, the only reason why not everyone can afford a stand mixer, the reason I have one is because I inherited it. And so what are ways that you all try to address accessibility in baking?
Well, and we did not write a book for professionals. We were really clear that the recipes in this book needed to be for the home cook. And most of them are things you can put together on a Tuesday night when you've hit the end of a long day. And as someone referenced earlier, you're just like, I need to do something to ground myself. So there's tahini chocolate chip cookies, or there's that chocolate pudding, or there's an incredibly simple pastry dough and a galette. I am of the belief that the less equipment you have, the more you learn. I like to make pastry often using my hands so I can feel when it's changing. I don't like to use fancy equipment. I mean, that pastry blender you got was probably $5. That is such a great, great tool. I have rotten bananas in my freezer. And when the pandemic first started and we all tried to get flour and yeast and we were told that it was sold out, it was a huge signal that baking is beyond a normal comfort. But during a time when there was and continues to be so much uncertainty, the baking is one of the very grounding things that we can do, whether we know what we're doing or we own a bakery and write baking books. So I think if you have a stick of butter and a little flour and some rotten bananas, you're on your way to having a gorgeous banana bread. Throw in some dried ginger and cinnamon. So it doesn't have to be this highfalutin, expensive, inaccessible thing. It's not what baking's about.
One of my favorite recipes in the book is a recipe from Ruth Reichel, which is an oatmeal cookie. It is the simplest thing ever. And in fact, when it came in, Kathy tested it first and we tested all the recipes back and forth in our kitchens. And she was like, I don't know, this isn't going to work. And 4 ingredients. And they're like the most perfect little oatmeal tuiles, and they're gluten-free. And I love it. Kathy shared it with a friend who made it with her 3-year-old. So, I mean, accessibility is something that I felt very strongly about, having run the test kitchen at Food Network for so many years, that like you have an obligation to the user of the book. And the user of the recipe to be successful. I mean, you have to sort of they should feel like you're right there behind you. So we also included tips for how to be successful, and that you don't need to spend a fortune, and that there's a range that, even the simplest recipe can be a wonderful experience for a very accomplished cook. So it doesn't I think that baking and the sharing of it is transformative and feels very, very empowering in this time.
I always think about my Polish grandmother who, was a victim of Hitler's troops in World War II, and she had nothing when she came to the United States, and some of the most amazing things that I've ever eaten were made with one mixing bowl and a wooden spoon. And so I think about that a lot when people are wondering, well, I don't have this, what do I do? I'm like, you're fine. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, that kind of reframed a lot for me. And especially as, COVID hit, I had a book coming out in April. And so I started doing a lot of Instagram live baking classes and just demos to, promote the book. And what I tried to do is use as few tools as possible. And really at home, I don't have much anyway, because everything has ended up at my store. But I wanted people to see that you really don't need much. And I think it's really important. And as far as, the alternative ingredients for gluten-free, dairy-free, whatever, I think it's really important to make that super accessible, because just because you have to eat that way or choose to eat that way doesn't mean you have a ton of money. And so what I found when I started on that journey of learning how to bake for myself and for others with alternative ingredients was that you would spend a ton of money on like 10 different flours or gums or whatever to make a gluten-free flour. And it was one recipe that this person just totally swears by, and then I hated it. And so then I have like $40, $50 worth of supplies for a flour that I really didn't like. And so what I chose to do for my book and what I choose to do for my bakery is to buy commercially available gluten-free flours that people can buy, like spend $9 on a bag of flour. And if you don't personally like that, then you're out $9 in one 5-pound bag or whatever it is. And so I think that's really important, is to find those like little ways to cut corners that still make a really delicious product, but are not taking up your entire cupboard, and you don't have rice flour falling on your head, or like 3 kinds of rice flour falling on your head. And so I think it's very important to find ways to make techniques, ingredients, and equipment super accessible for people. I get so many questions from people, like I said a little bit earlier, who are home bakers, but they get books that say like your butter has to be at 74 degrees or 72 degrees. And they're like, my thermometer isn't reading my butter temperature. And I'm like, you're fine. Like, as long as, I just feel like that's so stressful for people at home. It can either be room temperature, cold, or melted. And like, to me, as I've been baking professionally for, almost 20 years, and I have never temped my butter before I started doing anything. I just know that it is either melted, room temp, or cold, and you go or frozen. And those are like really great measures. So I really can't wrap my head around these like super inaccessible recipes for home bakers.
I just wanted to pick up on that for a minute. The other way to define accessibility is that a recipe works. When Catherine and I were testing recipes and creating recipes for this book, that woman, Katherine Alford, is a maniac. She will test something 10 times if she has to. But the truth of a cookbook is, doesn't matter how gorgeous it is, doesn't matter how spectacular the photography is, if the recipes don't work, you have wasted people's precious time, but their money. The butter's expensive, flour's expensive now. If your recipes don't work, you are really, really hurting people, and you've broken the wall of trust. And people, you know, I teach writing and I teach cooking to people, and that's a question they always ask, like, what's the most important thing about a cookbook? And I'm like, the recipes have to work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say the amount of times where sometimes I'll have to look up a term and I'm like, what does that reference? And it's great, a learning experience with time. Like, I definitely have been intimidated by recipes. I'm like, well,
Yeah.
you know, I can't, you know, this is a very expensive ingredient. If it doesn't work, you know, I think that definitely there's so many different, accessibility means so many different things when it comes to baking, for sure.
One of my favorite recipes in the book, and it sort of pulls together everything that Angela's saying and Kathy were all saying, is this recipe for vinegar pie, which is a traditional old Appalachian, you know, women in the middle of the Depression, they didn't have lemons, but they had apple cider vinegar, or they had some sort of vinegar in the house. And it has that tartness that a lemon curd would have, or a lemon pie. And it is kind of like this crazy, simple, delicious pie that also represents the ingenuity that women have of feeding their families and, you know, using what you have and making the most out of it and making something delicious out of it. And, you know, that's a metaphor for so many different things, but that I'm so into, Angela, what you're saying of, like, you know, make it real and make it and create trust and community around people using the book.
I was just going to say, one of my favorite recipes in here is my grandmother's peach coffee cake. And it's like a kind of a kuchen, I guess. So it's like a yeasted dough on the bottom and then canned peaches and a crumble on top. And I tried that. I was so embarrassed. I wanted to start selling it in my store because it's so good. She would only make it for special occasions, but I was so embarrassed that it had canned peaches. And so I used fresh peaches. I canned my own peaches. I like did all of these different things, and they were all trash. And so it was just like, kind of, as this young person who had come out of professional kitchens and, you know, oh my gosh, what if people find out I'm using canned peaches? But actually, it's just like the way that it's good. And yep. I think that it was really important to kind of have that realization for me. And when customers said, you know, I had a few customers say, like, oh, well, are these fresh peaches? And it took me a little bit of time to, like, gain that confidence to say, like, no, actually they're not, and this is why. Yeah. And it's so much better. I don't need to can my own peaches. Canned peaches are canned when they're really the best, and it's what makes the recipe so good. So I just thought of that when you were talking about the vinegar pie.
And so we are in the middle of a pandemic, and where so many people have been stuck to their homes. And we mentioned earlier, you know, especially in the beginning, you know, there was a baking boom. You couldn't get flour. There was a shortage of these ingredients. People got really into sourdough starters. It just seemed that everyone was either learning to bake, learning how much they loved baking again. And so why do you think that happened?
Well, I think we had a different sense of time and space. I know sometimes, you know, Kathy and I would be talking about this, like, what day of the week is it? You know, it's like you kind of lose everything. And also everyone's at home, the communal aspect of it, and also frugality of getting back to it. I mean, if you've always been like, oh, I'm going to go to the bakery, and the bakery is closed, you know, and get a good loaf of bread. But I also think that empowerment of, like, you can take something incredibly simple. I mean, sourdough is also, my husband at another time in our lives, he became obsessed with sourdough. And I felt like it was another child living in our house. He was feeding it. He was taking care of it. It was the most expensive loaves of bread that we ever had, but they were delicious. But it is that you have an engagement with the simpler things around you and the more powerful things, which is food. And I've heard just not even just baking, but food in general and cooking more and people realizing the value of just coming together over a meal and listening. We need more listening in this country.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, the book came out at the end of April, so my whole book team is like, what is gonna happen? This is not great timing. But it actually was great timing, if people could get ingredients. But what has been so cool is to see how many people are stuck at home and they have never baked before. And I always use one of my friends in the Bay Area as an example. So she had never baked before. She got my book and she started baking. And I think she started with cinnamon rolls, which is actually, I think, a pretty like courageous place to start. And if you've never baked before. And then she like perfected her cinnamon roll recipe. Then she perfected her crumble bun recipe, which is a filled bun that we have in here. And then she started getting into pies. And then what I really hope people take from this book, and from any book really, is to take different recipes and kind of put them together and in the way that they want or based on what they have at home. And so she had made the pie dough, she'd made the crumble topping from some of the buns, and she had made some of the fillings. And so she made like a galette from the pie crust recipe, and she made a filling from this recipe and the crumble from this recipe. And it's been so cool. And there's so many stories like that of people that I've seen who all of a sudden they have all this time at home and they're realizing like, oh, wow, what am I going to do at home? I can't just watch TV and work from home all the time. And so it's been very, very cool. And I think, like Katherine said, so many people who are connecting to like tangible work that you're able to connect over, and also being able to perfect something in a time like this is, you come out with a bunch of new skills.
That's one of the more beautiful things about this time is seeds were sold out, yeast was sold out, yarn is selling out. These kind of things that we've considered crafts, back to the land, growing your own garden. I'm telling you, I wanted to start a 1-800 number around April 1st, the number of phone calls that I was getting like, okay, I have the sourdough. I fed it last night. And it's like, calm, breathe, but people taking on these new skills with this new sense of time. You're not commuting anymore. You're working from home. Your kids aren't going to school. It's complete pandemonium. So again, I use that word grounding. I can't think, for me at least, of anything more grounding than baking. Dinner happens, but baking is that extra sweetness to a day, to a life that feels so unsettled right now. And as we've normalized into this pandemic, it's like, oh, I'm getting used to it, but I don't want to get too used to it. I live in a community where there are several incredible bakeries, but March and April and May, I was baking bread every week. And what I was doing was dropping it on people's doorsteps, because I couldn't eat that much bread, but I also couldn't stop baking because it, more than any pill or any meditation, creating that bread and pounding it down and feeling this outlet for anxiety and rage, and then being able to share it with neighbors, felt like I was building community in a way that I couldn't because we couldn't be together.
And before we get to the next question, I just want to say, if anybody in our audience has a question for our panelists, you can use the question to answer question. You can ask the question now. I promise we'll get to them, but I just want to give that call. But I'm really excited about the next question, so that's why I got that out of the way. So both of these books really give credit to women, the power of women, the joys of surrounding yourself with women, the empowerment of baking. And however, baking can be viewed at times as a stereotypical hobby for women. So what do you all feel is empowering about baking? What is the importance of baking?
Well, I think I was speaking to that in the piece that I, read, which is, it is an incredibly precise it uses chemistry. There's math involved in it. I mean, I have developed recipes for, you know, for over 2 decades, but baking recipes are much harder to develop. You know, it's fine to say, oh, saute a chicken breast and put, you know, some chilies or what, you know, like you can create with savory foods, as Kathy was saying, sort of in a much more easy improvisational way. Baking requires a lot more precision, and also care, and science. So I laugh at this idea that like baking, you know, sugar and spice and everything nice. I mean, like, no. And that reminds me, like when we were doing this book, we had a lot of fun naming recipes. So it's like we have a chapter about cookies and sugar and spice and tired of being nice. And you know, baking, some of, like, as I said, men get to be pastry chefs and women make cookies. And that's just a reflection, you know, of misogyny. I mean, that's really all that it is for me. I mean, if the skill and care of a good baker is not gendered. It's maybe it's because of, you know, too many bake sales at schools, but with women bringing them in. But we've seen the power of bake sales in this whole pandemic, and raising money and being empowered. I mean, one of the things this book does as part of the proceeds from Rage Baking will go to Emily's List, which supports female candidates, progressive female candidates. And I'm sort of digressing, but it stands for, Emily's List stands for Early Money is Like Yeast. And so we rise up and we are empowered. And that's what I think. I just disregard the whole idea that like baking is somehow less serious. It's very serious.
I was really touched by what you said, Angela, because I too, the little bit of baking I did as a child was with my paternal grandmother, who was a really good baker. And I would bake with my 2 daughters when they were young. But when we were writing this book, we were like, we have to be really clear that we're not telling women to get back in the kitchen. This is not a call to put on your apron and go bake for the PTO. This is about something bigger. For me, as I read in the introduction, it helped me get grounded enough so that I'm, you know, when I feel out of sorts, I bake, and then I go work for a candidate I believe in, or I've been standing in my town square holding signs for issues and candidates I believe in. And so in a way, baking for me empowered me to get back out into the world in a way. It's not about staying home and being the little woman baking. It's about building community. And I also will admit that this is my 16th cookbook. I have never considered myself a baker. I'm much more the kind of person that is attracted to savory because I don't like following rules. That's not my thing. I'm a very much color outside the lines person. But I think that's part of what appealed to me about baking during this difficult time, is that it does have rules and it does have science. It does have adaptability, but these are things that are really good for women and good for everybody. The idea of if you have your butter at the right temperature, you will be rewarded. If you let the dough rise enough, you will have a beautiful loaf of bread. It's like, I'm starting to rethink my personality.
I think that there's really, to me, I've been thinking about this as, you know, you both were talking, there's nothing that's not empowering about baking to me. So I have a bakery. I was there at 5 this morning with the ovens running, and I find it very physically empowering. You know, the women that I baked with growing up were the strongest people physically that I have ever known. You know, my grandma, my paternal grandmother stopped kneading dough on the counter because her arthritis was so bad that she would, and I always teach this in my classes too, if you don't want to knead on the counter for whatever reason, she would always put her dough in a mixing bowl, and she was very short, very stout, and she would just like get some leverage and just punch down the dough in the bowl and fold it over every so often. I find baking to be very empowering in this way that you were saying, Kathy. You know, you're rewarded when you do it the right way. And I think that, you know, it's empowering for so many reasons, and it feels good to be successful after a day of baking. I mean, I feel on top of the world. It's like, you know, a natural high to me. And, you know, you think about all the time that you spend in the kitchen, if you are baking for whatever reason, you're next to a hot oven, you're next to a hot stove. It's like sometimes very comforting in the winter or the fall, but you're also sometimes like suffering over that in the middle of summer because you want to do something nice for somebody. And that, you know, empowerment comes in so many different levels. And, you know, I think of how many times, you know, I would see my family, women in my family in the kitchen baking, and, you know, you can slap some meat on the grill outside and have your beer and chill out with your buddies. And that's great and cool. But what I see as like strength and power is like standing over, you know, whatever's cooking on the stove, what's in the oven. And that's strength, that's physical strength, that's perseverance. My mom finally started coming up with recipes that when we were kids that didn't require the oven in the summer. And there's a recipe, I put one of those recipes in the book. It's called turtle cookies. And it's basically a brownie batter that she put in a super old waffle iron. And then they cook for like 60 seconds. And then you put peanut butter frosting on top of them. And, you know, she found ways around the oven. But I think about my team at Goldenrod, and it's this group of women who, you know, I had experienced a lot of really negative situations, both in kitchen and friend life and work life in a lot of different ways. And what I found in creating this safe space, this empowering space for women, was that we could feel safe together. And that was something that I hadn't felt before. And so I see these women who are like coming to Goldenrod, and young people who work with me, and young people who come in as customers. And, you know, for example, a mom came up to me at an event once and said, I want you to know that my daughter, she's 15 and she deals with a lot of bullying at school. And she said, when we left your store one day, Mom, I think it's so cool that those girls all get along. And like, we don't always get along, but I want to be able to set that example that I never saw as a young person outside of my home, of women working really well together and not trying to vie for a top position or to compete against each other. And I think that's also very empowering.
I don't know, I'm sorry to bring this up, but I'm thinking about Mike Pence in the debate and the way that he spoke over two different women. And I'm looking at the four of us and the respect and sort of the camaraderie of this conversation. So
not that hard to let people finish.
Yes.
So we have a question. Keep those questions coming. We would love to hear from all of you. So Emmy Cubit asks, what's the best recipe when you have the most rage?
That's a great question.
Kathy, you want to go for that, Kathy?
Well, I mean, it really depends, but I find punching down yeasted batter, whether it's for bread, or there's an incredible, what we call a monkey bread that Catherine developed with maple syrup and nuts, but where things rise, and then the recipe asks you to make a fist and punch it down. And that release is so beautiful.
Yeah, I find the meditation of like yeasted recipes and kneading, you know, whether it's that recipe or there's a focaccia recipe in the book that it's long and slow, and that's what you get the results at the end where it's better. But then there's like instant gratification. Like I want something like fast and like gratification. And so there's actually, it's funny, there's a clafouti recipe in there, and a clafouti is basically a very simple custard with a crepe batter. And it's done with cherries and figs, and you can very easily adapt it. But I love we flambe the fruit, and so you have like the flames. That is very satisfying to me. I like the flame, and it like flares up, and it goes out pretty quickly, but that feels very satisfying. And then there's actually another recipe when we have a honey cupcakes called Don't Call Me Honey cupcakes. And there is a brittle on top, a honey brittle, and it's, as Angela was talking about, caramelizing sugar, and it bubbles up. And then when you add the baking soda to it. It is just like this volcanic thing that just explodes. And it, you know, sometimes I can feel that way. And it's really wonderful to see, to make that, and then it calms and chills out, and it's sweet and delicious.
I would say the best rage baking is multiple recipes so that you can disappear for a long time. And I was trying to think about the last time I was really pissed and what I made, and I think it was multiple things just so I could be unbothered for a while. Anything that's needed for sure. There's an apple cake in the book that I really love because I get to just chop a ton of apples. So the theme is kind of punching things, using a knife, fire, very dangerous things. But yeah, the apple cake is great. There's very little batter and a ton of apples, and it takes a long time to bake. And so I would pop that in the oven, have some cinnamon rolls going, and maybe start like these chocolate buckwheat cookies in the book are amazing. And you chop up chocolate really, really, really fine. And so you get to use a knife again. I say multiple recipes are best for rage baking.
I love
Keep
that.
yourself.
I wanted to address something about that. A lot of people, since our book came out in mid-February, have asked us, isn't cooking with rage like bad? Like, won't it make your food, you know, like, don't you want to cook with love? You know, that's what people always say, like, put love into your food. And we're not talking about transferring the rage into the dough or into the pie. We're talking about it as an outlet. So as you knead the dough, as you chop the apples, as you simmer the caramel, you find yourself calming down and focusing on something very concrete, which of course is going to reward you deliciously within an hour or so. But I love the idea, Angela, of hiding and baking for hours. We did that for 5 months.
Yes.
I
was
think
say, one of the things also of like make just a simple pie dough of like taking that rolling pin and like pounding it out, and the sounds and the visceralness of it. And then just, I get like running my hand over like the crust for a galette, and it's smooth and delicious, and you can see the pockets of butter in there. It's just, it's very, very, like I go from like that anger, and then it's like smooth and delicious.
I often get the question of like, how did you know that this was the field that you wanted to go into? And I said, well, it's the only thing that I've ever known that I wanted to do. And that's because when I bake, I think about nothing else. I completely shut off, even if I'm at work. I mean, usually since I'm running the business, I am like, okay, what am I going to do next? But for the most part, I don't think about anything that's wrong. And that's really hard to do, especially right now. And so I think that, you know, like you were saying, Kathy, you can be mad, but you can also put your meditative energy into something. So you're not giving, like, I mean, anger isn't an ingredient, love isn't exactly an ingredient either, but being mad doesn't translate into anything other than finding a way to finding your own meditation. And for me, that's what baking has always been. I'm not like a sit down and meditate kind of person, but to find something productive where you can totally shut off is a really beautiful thing.
And I think what we're really talking about is rage or love, or it's passion. And Angela, you know, this is what you're passionate about, that, you know, food people tend to be pretty passionate. It's a hard life, you know, you're working really hard, you're in the kitchen, you have to be passionate about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, I think about all the traditional women's crafts of, you know, sewing, baking, one of, you know, all the fabulous embroidery projects that people have been doing. I have an incredibly talented friend who's been making quilts all during these times that are incredible. And like, why do we discount these as not creative, important makers of things? You know, women are makers of things. And I think that's really something that needs to be celebrated.
Listening to Angela, I was just reminded, I think there's more than one recipe in the book in terms of that focus, where I wrote, do not answer the phone. Do not check Instagram. You need to pay attention. There's an incredible butter crunch candy with pistachios and dark chocolate, where it goes from beautiful and golden brown and bubbly to burnt in a split second. So that is the other thing that baking really asks of you, to pay attention, a singular focus, which is a therapy of its own.
We have another question. So Catherine Schwatter says, how have you actually used your baking to deliver specific messages? For example, on Instagram, the Sweet Feminists put messages on cakes and pies. But what are other ways that you have used that might be less literal than writing messages on pastries?
Well, I actually that's a great question, because I was just thinking about that. That was one of the things when we were doing this book and, thinking about it and going out and trying to get a publisher to be excited about it. And we were seeing this everywhere, that, the top of a cake is a palette, is an open palette for whatever messages that you may have on top. So, we have a really wonderful thing for right now, this time of year, an apple cheddar slab pie, sorry. And, we wrote "vote" on top of it. It was like, creates a subtle and delicious message. I think that, for us, the idea that we're donating a large part of the proceeds of this book to Emily's List, that, we're trying to encourage people to get out and vote. The whole thing of, bake sales or rewarding people for voting, and that it creates community. And that is the thing that we all are striving so much for and so feel so disconnected from. So I think there are lots of different ways that we can use baking to bring us together.
I also think, going back to something I said earlier, that if you bake a batch of cookies, bake 2 batch. And who is the elderly person down the street or in the apartment upstairs who hasn't been out in a few months, who's worried about being infected, or someone who's sick, or someone who's locked up with 4 kids? Drop a basket off with a recipe for a really simple cookie and give them the ingredients. We can't do things in the traditional way, which would be, I would say to all you women, come to my table. Let's have a dinner party. I'm going to make 4 pies. We're going to hang out. That opportunity is lost. So the past few months, I find myself constantly trying to figure out a COVID-safe version of what that is. And living in Maine, our window on seeing people outdoors, which is what's gotten me personally through the past few months, outdoor socializing, that window is closing, and that panics me. And I think that I will be doing a lot of sharing and dropping things off to try to replicate that sense of community that we used to have when we went to restaurants and sat at tables together.
Yeah, I think this holiday, we're starting to see all the people think, like, how are we going to reinvent Thanksgiving? And, is it everyone will make a dish and like share it together with each other, so it feels like everyone's eating together and contributing, like, I'll make the cranberry or I'll make the apple pie, and then we'll all pull it around. We're very ingenious, and we're seeing this everywhere, the kind of creativity that people are doing, whether it's in restaurants or in community, to find community. It's intrinsic.
So I would say now is a really, really hard time for businesses in the food industry to contribute to the community, and that's something that I've always tried to do with Goldenrod. But there are so many good causes, so I started thinking around the time of George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter, movement really coming to a head at the beginning of June. I was like, what can we really start to do right now? And without we aren't making enough money to make a huge financial contribution anywhere. So, for example, making merchandise at the store, where finding ways for customers to spend their money at knowing where that money is going to go. And, for example, we made a shirt that all of the money was, so half the money went to actually paying for the shirt. And then $18 of every shirt went to a law firm in Minnesota that specifically works with Black trans people and helping them. And another thing that we've done recently, we also, had a specific item where all of the proceeds, all of the money from that specific item in the case went to the Black Leaders movement in our community. So that's a way for us to contribute without breaking the bank. And I think that that's really important, whether you're a business or whether you're a person, just a citizen. How can you make a difference without, you know, breaking the bank for yourself? And I think there are a lot of ways. We started a program about 2 months ago. Public schools are open at 100% capacity here in Nebraska. And so we started thinking about the teachers and the people working at public schools. And so we set up on our online ordering system, we set up a way for people to donate to cookies and coffee for teachers. And so that's a way for us to keep, you know, my staff stays really busy at one of my locations. One of them is not super busy. So this was a way for people in the community, because it's so hard to know how you can make a difference on a bigger scale as just a person. And so people want to make a difference, but they don't always know how. So you can donate $15 and we'll take cookies and coffee to a public school. So we've been doing, I think we've hit about 20 schools in town. We've done both of the COVID units, or 3 COVID units in Lincoln for the medical team there. And I think just finding ways to use the resources you have and identifying the people in your community who need help the most, whether it's the elderly person who hasn't been out for a few months, you know, people who don't have the same privilege as you, or people who are really on the front lines. Like, how can you make a difference? And whether that's contacting, you know, a lot of schools, hospitals won't let you in with food or anything else if you're not a business of some kind. So go and talk to your local businesses who, and food places especially, they need your support right now. So if you can find a way to reach out to the places that you really love, that you don't want to see disappear, ask them if there's a way you can contribute for donations to be taken to a place with first responders, whether that's teachers or medical people.
Yeah, I can't stress that enough. I mean, what you're basically talking about, it doesn't have to be big. It's like simple acts of kindness. In my building in New York City, there are 2 principals, and they're like working their absolute butts off to get schools back open. And I just started, you know, cooking and sharing. You know, I couldn't eat all the things that I was baking. And they were like, oh my God, this just like, you know, something comforting while they're trying to juggle all the different things. And what you were saying, Angela, you know, support, be part of your community. That's what it takes. It doesn't take a lot of money. It just takes a lot of intent.
I also wanted to be really clear that everybody that buys a copy of Rage Baking, 25% of all the royalties will go to Emily's List to help support women candidates from the most local level up to President of the United States.
So we're winding down. I think we only have time for one really rapid fire question. I know this is hard, but what is one of your favorite recipes from each of your books?
Ooh.
Damn,
I know,
Sarah,
it's hard.
that's a
I
good
know.
one.
I'm sorry.
Who's your favorite child? I guess I'll say right now, just because it's fall and there's apples and pears everywhere, there's an apple and pear galette where the pastry is buttery and simple and no fail, and it's an open rustic pie with just gorgeous fresh apples and pears, and you can brush it with apple cider. But I love them all.
Yeah, I guess my favorite right now is a Don't Call Me Honey Cake. I love that one because it's really actually very simple, and I wanted it to be, you know, accessible. It's like made with yogurt that you might have, and honey doesn't require a lot of special ingredients, and then you have that sort of wild honeycomb on top. So I really love that one. But there's also, I just made it a tomato pie that was really delicious, I have to say. But that apple cheddar slab cake, slab pie, I don't know why I keep on saying cake. It's just perfect for right now. But oh my God, there's like the lemon pound cake is amazing. And there's actually, oh my gosh, Kathy did a mango curd that's so delicious. And there's also a flan that's just too good.
If I had to choose one, it would be the crumble buns, which is my favorite thing. And you can fill it with a lot of different things, homemade or not. And that's a primo #1 recipe.
Again, thank you so much to Angela, Catherine, and Kathy for being here with us virtually. Thank you everyone for attending. If you want to pick up a copy of the books you've heard about, you can find them on the festival's bookshop. We hope you make time to view many more of our sessions. Just visit the Six Bridges Books Fest site for a full schedule. Thank you all so much. This was so fun.
Thank you.
Thank
Sarah.
you.
Thank you, Sarah, Angela, and Kathy. Thank you.
Thanks to the
Thank
book
you.
Bake on. Bake on.
Have a good weekend.
festival.